And I worry very much that President Biden is putting himself in a position where he has alienated not just young people, but a lot of the Democratic base.
Senator Bernie Sanders was on CNN to discuss these campus protests, the ongoing mass atrocities being committed in Gaza, as well as how this relates to Joe Biden. Now, I'm going to get to 3 clips here. The way that especially he gets to or discusses Joe Biden's role in this, I have to imagine, but I mean, Bernie knows Joe Biden. I'm sure they have conversations. I'm sure he's tried to get through to him privately, but the fact that he is going public with a statement like this, I have to imagine he's having a tough time getting through to the obvious ideology that Biden has on this topic in a way that he doesn't really have for a lot of issues, because Biden up to now has largely been able to, is very malleable in the sense that if public polling shows a certain thing, he will then do something to support what the public supports. For example, the recent rescheduling of cannabis or student debt cancellation. Like, there are things that he has been moved on. But on Israel, he is unmovable up to this point. So the hope here, I would think, is a message like this getting through to Joe Biden, or at least platforming this idea and trying to get into his head. So I'm going to start here with his first comments.
Obviously, America has massive leverage because of its very strong, full-throated, shoulder-to-shoulder, all those words, alliance with Israel and all the billions of dollars that it sends. But do you think the students are reacting to the fact that their government does not seem to be using any leverage?
Yes, of course they are. Look, it is one thing if a terrible tragedy or a terrible war takes place in some part of the world where the United States really has no involvement. That is not the case in Gaza. The United States of America has historically and is right now, the legislation that you talked about, we're talking about over $19 billion more dollars going to Israel, including $10 billion in unfettered military aid. So, of course, the United States government has the right to say to Netanyahu, guess what? You're not getting another nickel unless you let humanitarian aid go in, unless you stop the imminent famine, which we are seeing, unless we move toward a two-state solution. When you are paying the bills, you call the tunes. Has the United States government done that? No, it has not. And I think students and the American people understand that that is very wrong.
All right, so for anyone that's been following this, this is a very obvious point, but it is one that is often not discussed in the coverage of what is going on, especially in the coverage of these campus protests, because there's often this retort or this criticism, oh, why are these students so focused on Israel? It's because the U.S. government is funding Israel as they are doing this. It is because their universities, their finances are intertwined with Israel as Israel is committing these acts. This is why the focus is where it is. So, you know, one of the dumbest criticisms I've seen since the beginning of this is, why aren't people protesting to bring the hostages home? As if, what, is the U.S. government, are they the ones funding the individuals holding the hostages? Well, what is the pressure point there? What would be the point of protesting what your government is already trying to do? Not to mention, this context is incredibly important. It is the Netanyahu government that are the ones that are rejecting the ceasefire. It's already been accepted by the other side. And I did a previous video on this where there's several instances of a ceasefire deal being on the table, and it is Netanyahu being the one that is rejecting it. There's even a case where the families of the hostages came in to the Knesset and were essentially protesting Netanyahu, trying to get him to support the ceasefire deal, and he wouldn't do it because it is in his political interest, if he wants to remain in power, to continue this ongoing bombardment as he's being propped up by a far-right faction. So to understand here, you know, why this has not ended, why the hostages aren't home, it's because of the Israeli government. Now, let me get to the next clip here. This is a really good... Bernie gets into connecting the history of student protests and also his own experience with that as well.
Where do these protests fit in the history of American student protests?
Look, I must tell you that as a young man, I was involved in civil rights demonstration. I was arrested in taking over the administration office at the University of Chicago because there was racism and segregation going on at that time. The truth of the matter is, if there had not been protests and sit-ins and demonstrations, we would not have made the progress we have made in this country in combating racism and ending the apartheid form of government that existed in many parts of the country. If there had not been millions of people, mostly women, coming out into the streets and saying that they are sick and tired of being second-class citizens, they want a right to control their own bodies, we would not have made progress in the struggle for women's rights. If we had not had demonstrations saying that we've got to end homophobia in America, would not have made the progress we have made. Demonstrations is what, and the right to dissent, the right to protest, that is what the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States is all about. That's what, in fact, makes you a free country.
More important context. And I got to give credit here to CNN's Christian Amanpour, because not a lot of other shows or anchors are allowing the space for this sort of reality to get out there, for this context to get out there. This is very clear. And it has been wild to see just the level of propaganda that I'm seeing from politicians and media. And of course, I'm used to seeing them spew garbage all the time. But the level of propaganda focused on vilifying these student protesters when it is so clear that they are correct, when their demands are very clear and how they relate to previous student movements. All of this is very obvious now. You don't have to wait 20 years to see who's on the right side of history. It is very clear right now. It's clearer than it's ever been. This is Bernie back in the 60s, when students like him were being vilified for standing up for human rights. And, you could maybe use the excuse back then that access to information was low. If you grew up very sheltered, very siloed in your own suburb, and you didn't interact with different viewpoints or different kinds of people, different races, then maybe you would grow up just not understanding this sort of movement, this sort of fight for civil rights. There is no excuse now. The information's right in front of us. And it's, if you want to see what the students are fighting for, you can go look it up. It's on their sites. All of this is very clear. If you want to understand the conflict better, the information's out there. So to be on the wrong side of history now, there's just no excuse, which goes again to a lot of these politicians, this media, they know they're full of shit, but it is their job to push a certain line, because at the moment, a lot of these protests are challenging the very corporations that they themselves at these large media corporations are intertwined with as well. So they have a vested interest to ensure that they are vilifying these protesters. And this is, again, a common theme throughout history. Very rarely do you see, whether it's the massive media, like mainstream media, or most politicians, very rarely are they on the correct side of history from the start. It takes protests like this to move society. This gets to Joe Biden and how Bernie relates what is going on now back to his presidency and the election.
Well, in terms of his campaign, I am thinking back, and other people are making this reference, that this may be Biden's Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson, in many respects, was a very, very good president. Domestically, brought forth some major pieces of legislation. He chose not to run in '68 because of opposition to his views on Vietnam. And I worry very much that President Biden is putting himself in a position where he has alienated not just young people, but a lot of the Democratic base in terms of his views on Israel and this war. So I would hope very much that from certainly a policy point of view, from a moral point of view, the president stops giving a blank check to Netanyahu. And I would hope that they understand that from a political point of view, this has not been helpful, quite the contrary.
And of course, Bernie is exactly right. Based on all the data we are seeing, based on how Joe Biden won in 2020, with a lot of young people coming out to vote. Look, I have to imagine that Bernie's having or has had these private conversations with Joe Biden. He has worked with him very closely on a variety of issues, especially as it pertains to workers' rights. For him to go on CNN and put this message out there, to me, says that Biden is not listening, that Bernie's trying to have this conversation and Biden simply does not care. This is, when you put a message out like this publicly and you know the guy you're talking about, that's typically what this means, is that there is a reason why he's saying this publicly, why he's willing to criticize Biden in this way and focus the conversation in a way that I really haven't seen, again, any other politician discuss. The comparison to the Vietnam War in terms of, or how it relates to the presidency. This is the reality with Joe Biden. From Truth Out Here, polls have found that public opinion has shifted dramatically against Israel since October, as Israeli forces have killed over 34,000 Palestinians with heavy use of U.S. weaponry, which, by the way, this is an out-of-date number because there is no longer the infrastructure in place in Gaza to count the amount of people that have either been that are either casualties or injured in what's happening. So this is an estimate from, I believe, early March. We haven't really had an update since then. But going on here, with only 18% of Democrats approving of Israel's siege of Gaza and 75% disapproving, according to a Gallup survey released last month. And I'll get to that date in a second here as well. Young voters in particular are opposed to Israel's massacre. A January poll found that a plurality of people aged 18 to 29 say Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, with only 24% disagreeing. The dissent on U.S. policy in the Middle East has driven voters away from Biden, contributing to a plummeting approval rating among young voters amid the assault. Now, some people see this and think, what, they're going to vote for Trump, who might be worse on this? No, they're just not going to vote. They see two options who both are supporting these mass atrocities, and they don't want to vote for either of them. So this is not on young voters. This is not on voters generally. This is on the administration to make a major shift in how they are going about this. And that major shift would be end the funding. At the very least, have some conditions on it. Because right now, it looks less like Biden's helping Netanyahu and more like Netanyahu is running the U.S. government. That's how this is actually appearing. And this is that change over time. So changes in views on Israeli military action in Gaza by party ID. Do you approve or disapprove of military action Israel has taken in Gaza? You see a shift across the board. So even Republicans, their disapproval has gone up, even though it hasn't been a whole lot. But what Biden has to worry about, of course, is independents and Democrats. These right-wing voters are going to vote for Trump no matter what. It doesn't matter what he does. Biden has, again, if all you care about is winning an election, which hopefully you care about human life, but in lieu of that, because it doesn't appear Biden cares about human life, maybe he cares about winning an election. Based on this alone, he is losing a lot of people, his own voters. And this, again, this will be one of the main issues. People think, it's going to go away by November. Why would it? Look at what's already happened. Those lives that have been lost are not coming back. Michigan is likely gone at this point, based on, his numbers there and the Arab American population that is heavily concentrated there. That state's likely gone. So there has to be a dramatic shift if he hopes to recoup what is ever left. And I don't know. The hope is that you have more politicians like Bernie go on media and continue putting this pressure on and do what they can. But it's disturbing just to see, forget about the election. I don't care about the election. I care about what is happening right now. And it's disturbing to see just the level of destruction this White House is willing to accept.